Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the January installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. My name is Ellen Van Velser. I'm a Senior Fellow in Research and Innovation at the Center for Creative Leadership and a board member of ILA. I will be moderating this webinar with Chris Ernst and Donna Chrobot-Mason. Chris is a senior faculty member in CCL's organizational leadership practice. Donna Chrobot-Mason is an associate professor in psychology at the University of Cincinnati and director of the Center for Organizational Leadership. Donna and Chris, of course, are co-authors of the wonderful new book from McGraw-Hill titled Boundary Spanning Leadership: 6 Practices for Solving Problems. Before we start, I'd like to note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they'll be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Secondly, we realize that you may have questions during the talk. If your question is a question of clarification, you may ask it by typing the question into the question box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. However, if your question is a more substantive one, please just make note of it for yourself and hold it till the end of the talk, when there will be a few minutes for the speakers to take those questions. So, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Chris Ernst. Chris?
Well, great. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you all for joining us today. We've got a great audience, professionals across a wide range of sectors, contexts, and cultures. And so before we start in earnest, Donna and I would like you to think about this question. How important is it for you to collaborate across boundaries in your professional and community life? So this may involve working across organizational levels or functions or disciplines or with wide-ranging stakeholder groups. It may involve working in various types of partnerships or with groups of people with very different ethnic, cultural, or spiritual orientations. It may even involve attempting to cross political divides. I thought one of the more interesting lines in the President's State of the Union address here in the United States last night was when he said, "The real test is not whether we can sit together," and he was referring to the unusual seating arrangement in which Republicans and Democrats sat in pairs, but rather, he said, whether we can actually work together. Anyway, if you are like the leaders that participated in our research, Donna and I imagine that you believe that collaborating across boundaries is pretty important. As part of the research behind our new book, we asked this question to 128 senior leaders working in the corporate and nonprofit sectors. And in response to the question that you see on the slide, 86% of those senior leaders said that this was very important. That's the dark blue bar on the left. But then when we asked them, how effective are you at doing that, only 7% said they were very effective at doing so. And so 79% represents the critical gap. These are leaders who have made it to their top. They're working in some of the finest organizations in the world, and they're telling us, here quite candidly, that spanning boundaries is very important, and yet it's not very easy to do. And so in our research, we wanted to understand this gap, not just what causes it, but more importantly, how to develop the leadership to close it. Our research at the Center for Creative Leadership began where Thomas Friedman left off. The World is Flat helped us to understand what our new interdependent world looks like. Friedman describes it as a world where borders are dismantled, the playing field is now leveled, and everything is connected to everything else. And so for the past decade, Donna and I, along with over 50 colleagues inside and outside of CCL, have been on a journey to understand the leadership implications of this flat and interdependent world that Friedman wrote so persuasively about. Our research and our practice has taken us across 6 world regions, from Africa to Asia, Europe, the Middle East, North America, and to South America. And we've conducted and analyzed nearly 3,000 surveys and 300 in-depth interviews, translated and back-translated from a variety of languages. I know we've got people of multiple different cultures on the phone here today. And we work with leaders and executives in corporate settings, education settings, military, and nonprofit organizations around the world. And what we discovered is that Friedman is right. The world is flat. Yet, our relationships with one another remain as divided and jagged as ever. From China to South Africa and from Brazil to communities across the United States, we learn that all too often powerful boundaries create borders that divide groups into us and them. These boundaries get in the way between groups of people that need to be working collaboratively together. They create limits and constraints, they lead to wasteful conflict, and ultimately to counterproductive outcomes and results. And so in a twist to current thinking, Donna and I believe that in a flat world, bridging boundaries between groups is the new and critical work of leadership. So simply put, we wrote this book to help leaders at all levels in a wide-ranging context to be able to realize new and inspiring results at the nexus between groups. And it's been inspiring for us and for our many CCL colleagues to see how these ideas are being adopted and applied in organizations around the world, from the highest levels of the United States government to dozens of global corporations to grassroots and community-based institutions in many countries globally. And so for the next hour, our goal here is to bring you into this conversation around what we have learned about leadership in today's interdependent world. Here's our agenda. We're going to cover these 4 questions. What is boundary-spanning leadership? Why is it needed? How can leaders span boundaries? And so what are the implications for you and for all of us collectively? Now, as you can appreciate, it's a daunting task here to try to distill a 10-year project into a 60-minute webinar. And so our goal here, what we've decided to do is really focus on the key ideas. And so, of course, let's be honest. We hope that you're going to want to learn more, and you're going to want to read the book. You're going to want to talk with us about possible research or practitioner collaborations that we can do. And also, at the end of the session, we're going to mention several additional free resources that we can point you towards to be able to continue your own learning. Okay, so that's it for an introduction. Donna, I'm going to now turn it over to you to discuss our first question.
Great, thanks, Chris. So exactly what is boundary-spanning leadership? Let's tackle that question together by focusing for a moment on just these 3 words. And to do this, I'm going to ask you to provide input into the question space. Okay, so let's start with the word boundary. What word, image, or phrase comes to mind when you think of the word boundary? Please go ahead and type something into the space provided. So when you hear the word boundary, just what comes to mind? Let's see, I'm not getting very many responses yet. Okay, here they are coming in. Border. What else? What else comes to mind when you hear the word boundary? Limits to access, separation, thank you. Stop. Limitations. Barriers, great. Lots of mention of limitations. Boundaries, borders, fences, walls, thank you. So yes, this is exactly what we're referring to when we talk about the word boundary. Let's move now to the word spanning. When you hear the word spanning, what comes to mind? The word spanning. Bridge, yes. Openness, absolutely. Crossing. Crossing divides, yes. Bridging, connecting, linking, excellent. This is what we're talking about. So those words, boundary spanning, we've defined. Now let's go to leadership. Now I know from years of teaching and consulting that if I ask you to tell me what comes to mind when I say the word leadership, we could spend the rest of the webinar just focusing on this word. So I'm going to cut to the chase here and say that we're using CCL's definition of leadership, which is that a leader is not necessarily a specific individual or even a formal position of authority, but rather it is a social process that focuses on achieving 3 outcomes: direction, alignment, and commitment. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Direction answers the question, where are we going? Alignment, how will we coordinate our resources in order to get there? And commitment, how will we stay engaged and accountable to reach our shared destinations? Okay, so if we put these 3 words together then, boundary, spanning, and leadership, you've got the gist of what we're going to talk about today. Boundary spanning leadership is about bridging, connecting, linking, bringing together various barriers, borders, walls, fences, in order to create the direction, alignment, and commitment that is needed to achieve some shared vision or goal. Now, let me explain this a little bit more clearly in a visual here. So to illustrate this, we have 2 distinct groups that you see in front of you, the green group and the blue group. And the green group could be, for example, sales, and the blue people marketing. The green people could represent senior managers, and the blue people might represent line managers. The 2 groups could be the Brazilian workforce and the American workforce. You get the idea. The nature of the groups is practically limitless. But in today's interconnected workplace, wide-ranging groups increasingly need to come together to achieve some shared goal or mission. They need to do this to solve a problem, develop some new solution, or lead change in their organization. And the role of leadership is to create direction, alignment, and commitment by spanning that boundary between the groups in order to achieve that larger purpose. Now, it looks nice and easy on this screen, but we know that it's often easier said than done. These are significant challenges that you all face. So let's talk about those challenges for a moment. Let's pause and do some reflecting on your own experience with spanning boundaries. So think about this question for me, if you would. What is a challenge that you or your organization currently face that can only be solved by collaborating across boundaries? Go ahead and please enter this into the question space, if you would. Think about a particular challenge that you or your organization or community might face that can only be solved by collaborating across boundaries. Funding, student retention, student enrollment is diminishing, creating different strategic goals. Let's see, failure to establish shared collaboration and purpose, yes. K through 12 education, accomplishing our mission during severe budget cuts. Yes, absolutely, that's a great example we're all facing. How do we collaborate amidst all of this chaos? So those are some wonderful examples, and I'm sure you can come up with many more, as these are certainly issues that we're facing in our society today. So let's see. Let me tell you a little bit about our research as we try to tackle some of these issues. Based on our research involving interviews with hundreds of leaders, we've discovered that a new approach to leadership is needed in order to solve these very challenges that you're sharing with me. Spanning group boundaries is a significant leadership challenge because it involves not just a change in our operational systems or structures, but also because it involves change in deeply rooted issues of identity. We're talking about human relationships. It's not just about what we do, but it's who we are. That's what's really getting in the way. What has worked in the past is not fully sufficient anymore for dealing with these challenges that are prevalent in our global workplace. And our research revealed that new techniques, tactics, and tools are needed. Now that we've covered what boundary spanning leadership is and what boundary challenges you might face in your own organization, Chris will help us explore why boundary spanning is needed. Chris, over to you.
Great, thank you, Donna. In our research, leaders and executives describe 5 types of boundaries that all of us need to work across today, no matter your culture or your context. We are all challenged, as Donna was saying, to find new ways to be able to create direction, alignment, and commitment across vertical, horizontal, stakeholder, demographic, and geographic boundaries. Vertical boundaries are found across levels, power, and authority structures. And for the next several slides, you're going to see some quotes from some of our actual research participants. And so let's go ahead and listen now to a quote about vertical boundaries. This comes from the SVP who participated in our research working in the auto industry. Over to you.
We have a boundary that runs up and down the organizational chart. We have work to do to create better interaction between senior executives and middle to entry managers.
Ah, yes, good old hierarchy challenges are still very much alive and well. Next, we've got horizontal boundaries, and these are found across functions, units, disciplines, and areas of expertise. And so here we have a quote from the head of a government R&D agency.
My organization consists of 8 functional units and 7 laboratories, in which more and more of our problems require cross-functional solutions. Unfortunately, each lab has its own management culture, and this causes real challenges in partnering.
Oh yeah, good old silos and stovepipes. We all know about that one. All right, stakeholder boundaries are represented by external groups and interests. You name it. We're talking about customers, supply chain partners, joint ventures, alliances, government agencies, and the cities and communities in which we operate around the world. So here's a quote. This time it's from the group president of a global clothing retail company.
We struggle in creating effective customer-vendor relationships. There is a great need for creating common goals, but our objectives are often conflicting.
Thanks for that. Demographic boundaries represent the entire range of human diversity, from gender to age and from personality differences to ideology. Let's see what a senior executive in pharmaceuticals has to say.
We are incorporating more and more diversity into our organization from what used to be a very monolithic culture. It brings enormous advantages, but also management challenges.
Great. And lastly, geographic boundaries are found across markets, regions, locations, and distance. For this one, we're going to go to China for a quote from a general manager in a telecom company.
We must learn to collaborate not only across our vast country, but with people from around the globe.
Well, thank you, Ashley, or I'm sorry, I mean general manager in China. All right, so as we said, we've got 5 types of boundaries. Now, as you all know from your experience, we talked about them all separately, but they are all very much intertangled. And this explains why boundary spanning leadership is so challenging. So it requires leading across multiple interacting boundaries simultaneously at this sort of intersection or nexus where wide-ranging and oftentimes conflicting groups collide, intersect, and link. All right, so at this time, we're going to do one poll in this webinar. We're going to go ahead and do that now. And what we'd like to do is hear your thinking about these 5 types of boundaries. And we've got 2 questions for you. We're going to start with the one that you see at the top of your screen. And we'd like to hear, where is your organization at its best? Or it could be an organization you're currently working with or one that you're familiar with. But we'd like to know across what type of boundary is your organization most effective at collaborating across. You'll see the poll open up here in a moment.
Okay, and while we tabulate those votes, we can probably handle the second poll. Chris?
Okay, great, thank you. And so as those results are coming in, now we want to know the opposite question. We want to know where does your organization struggle the most? So this one is around across what type of boundary is your organization least effective at collaborating. Or another way of saying that, across which type of boundary is your organization least effective at creating clearer direction, of coordinating resources, of alignment, and of being engaged and committed to that shared purpose. So where does your organization now struggle the most? So we're going to give that a minute for the polls in progress, and then Ashley's going to close the poll, and I will be able to see the data. And hopefully then I'll be able to just real quick give you a comparison to how your own responses compare to what we found in our own research. All right, so I've got, looks like polls are closed. All right, good. I think they are coming in. Great. Okay, I believe that you cannot all see them, but I do here. So here we go. Where are you at your best, most effective? Highest score was around horizontal boundaries, working across functions and units and expertise, followed by stakeholder boundaries, then demographic boundaries, then vertical, then geographic. So we had horizontal, stakeholder, demographic, followed by vertical and geographic. And then let me drop down to least effective. Here, this is the first, Donna. So we have least effective is the same number one, horizontal, at 35%, followed by vertical at 30%, demographic at 20%, stakeholder at 10%, and geographic at 5%. So obviously the most striking finding is that we have a split perspective here amongst us as horizontal represents both where we're at our best and where we struggle the most. So how does this compare to what we found? Almost by a 3-to-1 margin in our work around the world, we have continued to find that horizontal boundaries represent the single biggest pressure point in organizations today. This issue of fragmentation, of silos, of stovepipes is really what are keeping senior executives up at night right now. And so finding that as being topping the list, least effective, is not surprising. Now, the finding around it also being where people on the phone today find it to be most effective is a first. And we've now done this, getting up to with hundreds of, near over 100 different organizations now in different regions, and we've never seen that before. So this is a conversation we'd love to take offline with you, and love to hear more thoughts about what is you're doing well. What we typically find here is that organizations tend to say where we're doing our best is around vertical boundaries. And the best explanation, we ask why is this so, is that after so many years of hierarchy that organizations, they've largely figured out how to do this, how to lead vertically, up and down the organizational chart. And then the last thing I'll share is when we look just 3 years out to the future, when we look down the road, what we see happening are those last three groups, stakeholder, demographic, and geographic, becoming increasingly important. So that as organizations become more networked in a transparent, external, multi-stakeholder environment, as they employ an increasingly diverse workforce, and as they expand their research to all corners of the globe, our research suggests that these stakeholder, demographic, and geographic challenges are only going to increase over time. So great, super conversation there. Really appreciate the responses, and would love to hear any comments back from you about what are you doing well around the horizontal dynamics, because that certainly is a real pressure point today. All right, I'm going to pass things back to Donna, and we're now going to talk about the critical question of how can leaders span boundaries. Donna, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. So, our research identified 3 overarching strategies for leading across boundaries. These are 3 fundamental and we believe universal approaches that occur across widely varying organizational cultures and also contexts. And they are managing boundaries, forging common ground, and discovering new frontiers. So we're going to talk about each one of these in turn next. So let's start with managing boundaries. If I can get the slide there. There we go. So looking at the image on this slide, what is your initial sense of what this strategy may involve, just based on the words that you see and the picture in front of you? Go ahead and type that into the question space for me if you would. What do you think this strategy might be about? What could it mean with regard to boundary spanning leadership? Any thoughts that you have, just based on the picture that you see? So managing boundaries, you see a fence, some evergreens on one side, green grass on the other. Go ahead and type into the question space what you think this strategy might possibly be about. Let's see, I'm not getting any responses.
Donna, we're getting a good number of responses that you may not be able to see. Would you like me to read you a few?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Building a fence helps define a boundary and helps it clarify the two sides' positions. Boundaries between the controlled and chaotic areas. Being clear of the integrity of the boundary. Maintaining distinctiveness. Recognizing barriers that need to be overcome. Looking for a gate, a passageway. Those are some of the responses I'm seeing now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So you all are getting the basic concept then of managing boundaries. And the way we define managing boundaries is that it involves first defining and then understanding the boundaries that exist. So before we can span across boundaries, we must be able to see that boundary or see both sides of the fence clearly. So managing boundaries involves defining roles and responsibilities and helping the groups create a sense of identity. Now, managing boundaries focuses on our differences. And researchers tell us that we all have two fundamental human needs, we all do, and that these are a bit of a paradox because on the one hand, we have a need to differentiate ourselves from one another and create a sense of uniqueness. But on the other hand, we have a deep need to connect with other people and develop a sense of belonging. Now, while these needs are indeed paradoxical, they're both important and contribute to a healthy identity for all of us. Thus, there are powerful needs or forces at work in dealing with boundaries and in our relationships with one another. Those are the power of differentiation and also the power of integration. And we know that attending to both is key to effective leadership. So, managing boundaries meets our need for both differentiation, uniqueness, or divergence. Sorry, I think I overclicked on that one. Let me go back for a moment. It taps into the power of differentiation. And just as you see here by the fence, that old adage of sometimes good fences make for good neighbors, well, we believe that to be true here as well, that fences are indeed necessary and important in our organizations. So let's go to the next overarching strategy, and that is forging common ground. Let me ask you to do the same thing, and hopefully I'll be able to see your responses this time. But if you look at this, just the image that's in front of you and the words, forging common ground, tell me if you would please, just what is your initial sense of what this second strategy may involve, just based on the words and the pictures that you see here? Okay, so I see building a bridge, finding joint goals, connecting with one another, yes, bridging the gap between joint goals, finding a shared vision, finding similarities, absolutely. So forging common ground is about focusing on our similarities. It meets our need for unity, belonging, and also convergence, and it taps into the power of integration and emphasizes our similarities instead of our differences. So it focuses on what we have in common with one another, and it involves suspending and reframing boundaries. What happens, we think in our research, is that over time and sustained interaction, the boundaries that created rigid borders between groups eventually begin to fade into the background. And what emerges then are the connections and the links that unite people, just as this bridge shows here. So now that you know the drill, let's move on to the next one and look at this next image and the words "discovering new frontiers." Again, if you would please, just share with me what you're seeing here. Just based on the words and the image that you see, what do you think this strategy might be about? Exploring a new path. Finding new ways to reach goals together. Adventure. Ooh, I like that one. A new horizon. Absolutely. Discovering what is over that horizon, moving forward. Yes, absolutely. Opening up a new pathway. Moving beyond our groups. These are great images. Thank you. Those are wonderful words. Absolutely. Discovering new frontiers is about emerging possibilities and the future opportunities that lay before us. It involves interlacing and cross-cutting boundaries to take advantage of both the differences and the similarities between our groups. Discovering new frontiers meets both our need for differentiation or uniqueness and also our needs for integration or belonging at the same time. It taps into both of these fundamental forces simultaneously. And it's here at this intersection where the most advanced and innovative opportunities can be realized. So, managing boundaries, forging common ground, and discovering new frontiers are the three overarching strategies that we discovered. Now, out of these come 6 practices, the actual behaviors and the tactics that leaders use to span those boundaries. In the book, of course, we dedicate an entire chapter to each one of these practices, and we go into great depth. We provide a case study and specific tactics and lots of examples. But today, we're just going to focus on the main ideas. So let me start with buffering. The first practice is called buffering, and it involves defining and clarifying boundaries. And just as the image that you see here shows a red line between the green and the blue groups, buffering involves defining and clarifying our different roles and responsibilities. So each group, the green group and the blue group in this example, clarifies for itself who they are, what they value and prioritize, and what role they should play in the organization. In essence, then, both groups have to define their boundaries. Now, when groups feel they are protected from outside threats and demands, and they clearly understand the boundaries that exist between them, that fence, if you will, the outcome is that both groups will experience a sense of safety and security. And that is because they've become confident in who they are, and perhaps even more importantly, who they're not. So they know what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. So building on that sense of safety and security, then we can focus on reflecting, which is about understanding boundaries. So as you see in the image here, the green group must take steps to better understand the blue group and vice versa. Here, both groups need to take time to learn about the differences between one another, how they differ in their values, their priorities, experiences, perspectives, any way that they differ. And the outcome of reflecting is that both groups develop a greater awareness and respect for one another. They clarify that red line, that boundary, and the differences between one another. And in the process, they begin to uncover what they have in common, which then can set the stage for spanning that border that separates them. So once that stage is set for spanning and bridging and connecting, that leads us to the next practice, which indeed we call connecting. And this involves suspending boundaries. So what you see in this image is that members of the green group and the blue group actually step outside of their respective boundaries into a more neutral territory. So both groups suspend, if you will, their greenness and their blueness, even if just for a short time, and step into that neutral territory. And the goal is to forge relationships between members of the green group and the blue group by focusing on just individuals, just person-to-person linkages, and taking group differences out of the picture, so to speak. So people learn to set aside their group differences and make connections based on their individual similarities. And the boundary or the barrier fades into the background. Again, maybe just for a short time at first, but then over time it fades more and more into the background. And the outcome is that we begin to see people outside of our group as individuals with similar needs, values, hopes, and dreams, and over time we view them as more similar than different. So our view of what constitutes us becomes larger to now include people who were once considered them. And trust increases and mutual confidence expands as each group develops confidence that the other group will consider their interests at the same time. Once that trust is established and that mutual confidence, we can move to mobilizing, which involves reframing boundaries. The idea here is to create a larger boundary that now encompasses both of our groups. So we create a shared identity which includes all members of the green group and the blue group. And this new reframed boundary, shown as the red circle in our picture, represents some common purpose, a shared goal, or even a vision that binds the blue and the green group members together. Mobilizing encourages groups to move outside of their smaller group identity and to move inside this new, larger, more inclusive identity that is shared by everyone. And the outcome of mobilizing is a sense of community among group members, as well as ownership and accountability to a shared direction and vision. So now Chris is going to walk us through the last two boundary spanning practices.
Great, thank you, Donna. So let me just do a quick check-in here to say that Donna and I fully recognize that this is a lot to take in all at once. And again, for a 1-hour session, our goal here is really to make this a conversation starter for across the ILA community. And so as a quick review, so Donna's talked about the first two strategies about managing boundaries and forging common ground and the 4 practices associated with that. And I'm going to now pick it up to the last 2 practices for discovering new frontiers. And so as you see on the slide, weaving is about interlacing boundaries. Groups are woven together like threads in a tapestry. So each group now remains distinct with different expertise, areas of knowledge and experience, yet at the same time, they're integrated in different ways to form a larger whole, in the same way that different threads are woven to create a rug or a mosaic. And the outcome of this is that interdependence and collective learning is advanced between groups. That groups begin to see their differences not just as problems to reconcile, but as the very source for learning, to discover new combinations, ideas, and sources of value above and beyond what they could achieve independently on their own. Now, the final practice, transforming, is about cross-cutting boundaries. And to cross-cut means to cut against the grain or on the bias. So like in the image, transforming occurs when multiple groups are brought together in new ways. They cross-cut their respective boundaries in search of new possibilities. And what happens over time is that identity-based values, beliefs, and perspectives shift and change in fundamental ways. The outcome of this is that old boundaries are transformed into a new space, a space for reinvention, renewal, and the creation of alternative futures. And as we discuss in the book, we see hopeful signs of this occurring in organizations and communities around the world. Okay, to quickly summarize then, there are 6 boundary-spanning practices for leading at the intersection where groups collide, intersect, and link. And indeed, we did present them in this order because there is a natural progression. Intuitively, you likely grasp that progression. And just as you might be able to see that progression as you look at these images here on the screen, from managing boundaries to forging common ground to ultimately discovering new frontiers. And so while these diagrams look quite simple, the reality is that there's nothing simple about this in practice, is that we're dealing with complex human relationships. But what we can say is based on a decade of research in 6 regions of the world, as well as looking at the leading edge knowledge in the field that's coming out right now, is that when leaders need to bring groups together to accomplish a higher purpose or goal, these 6 practices will help. Okay, quick time check. Ellen, how are we doing? I've got about 10 minutes, so that's a good place to be. Okay, so we're going to bring it home now by talking about implications. And the way we're going to do this is hot off the press right here. This was just endorsed institutionally by CCL last Friday, and so this will be the first time that this slide has ever been presented, which is really an idea that we have. And what it represents is that given the state of our complex and independent world, CCL is committing itself to developing leadership at all levels, within and across individuals, groups, organizations, and our broader global society. And given that Donna and I know that you all have experience and expertise at working in these various levels, Donna and I thought we'd like to end by engaging you with the consideration of how we, both individually as well as collectively, can develop new, more collaborative, more interdependent, more boundary-spanning capabilities, starting at the individual level and moving ultimately to the societal level. So we want to engage you in some reflection about the agenda going forward. We're going to start with the individual level. Now, as you're all aware, organizations have long focused on preparing leaders for vertical advancement to higher levels of responsibility. The old adage about climbing the ladder. Yet, as we've been talking about today, today's organizations look more like this. And so, career pathways need to look less like vertical ladders and more like zigzags. We need to be finding ways of providing leaders with new types of what we call boundary crossing experiences, whether they be assignments, project teams, or developmental relationships, but ways that enable leaders to develop new skills and mindsets to work not just vertically, but sideways and diagonally. And so a question for reflection: you could be a practicing leader yourself, you could be a researcher of leadership, or you could be a developer of leadership capabilities in others. But we think that this is an important question for us in ILA and more broadly to think about, is how can we play a role to develop leaders to work collaboratively across boundaries. Next, taking it to the group level. Over the past decade, significant focus has been given to developing effective groups and teams. And here you see a network diagram of a team that was created by Rob Cross, who's one of our research collaborators and a leading network researcher at the University of Virginia. We now know a lot about how to develop high-performing teams. If you consider this red matrix here a team, we know a lot about building team cohesion and the good old forming and storming and norming and performing. But here's the question: what happens? Okay, what happens when members of one team or group now need to interact in new ways with members of another team or another group, especially when there's a history of competition or even conflict between them? And so this creates a wholly new leadership dynamic with an important shift from within groups to looking at across-group dynamics. And so the second implication we think that it's important for all of us to consider is, how do we help groups and teams to work across the boundaries between them? Now, our boundary spanning work is most focused here, but in addition, this is a rapidly growing area in the field. For example, we recommend that you check out Todd Patinsky's work. He did, I know, an ILA webinar last year that I participated in. Consider Deborah Ancona and her colleagues' work at MIT, or Linda Grotten's work on hotspots at London School of Business, or Rob Cross' work on organizational networks, someone I mentioned that we're working with at the University of Virginia. And there's also new and important research going on at various university centers. So I want to call out the multi-sector leadership work going on at the Tobias Center, as well as the Center for Integrative Leadership at the University of Minnesota. There's an increasing recognition that the way that we develop leadership within teams is in many ways quite distinct from the ways that we develop leadership across teams, and that needs to be on our collective agenda. Third, developing organizations to span boundaries. And I'm going to really cut to the chase on this one. At CCL, we've identified 3 types of leadership cultures, with each type including and transcending the previous type. So if I just simply, you can get this idea by looking at these images, looking at the words. If you think about this in terms of 3 C's, a dependent culture you can think about as being a culture of conformance. An independent culture is a culture of cooperation. And an interdependent culture is one of wide-scale systemic collaboration. And so what we found in applying these boundary-spanning practices in all types of organizations is that they tend to flourish and thrive as cultures become more interdependent. And yet at the same time, these 6 practices can be used in any type of culture, and they will, over time, help evolve the broader organizational culture towards greater levels of interdependence. So regardless, we think the implication here is that how can we help develop leadership cultures that cultivate and encourage widespread cross-boundary collaboration? Okay, Donna, over to you to help bring us home.
Thanks, Chris. And finally, Let's see. We ask that you consider the implications of a world in which we find ways to span boundaries and work collaboratively with one another versus a world where we have failed to do so. So climate change, economic crises, job creation, natural disasters, poverty, and education. These are the biggest issues that we face in our society today, and we think they can only be solved by spanning and bridging boundaries. That's why we believe that spanning boundaries is the new and the critical work of leadership. Our most pressing leadership challenges require that we view problems as shared dilemmas, that we relate to one another as collaborators, and that we work together to find a solution that enables and empowers us all. Thus, we would like to challenge you to ask the same question that we ask of ourselves. How can we contribute to a world that must span boundaries in order to thrive? Now, as you contemplate the answer to this question, I'd like you to consider something else. Let me take us back to the opening discussion. Recall that we began by describing the word boundary. And you told me the phrases that came to mind for many of you when I mentioned boundary were things like borders, barriers, limits, constraints, obstacles. And it's true, if you look this word up in the dictionary, those are the words that you will typically see. A boundary is something that indicates bounds or limits. And just as these images show, clearly limitations. However, if you look closely enough, you will eventually come across an alternative definition in the dictionary. The dictionary also defines a boundary as a frontier. A frontier represents the newest and most advanced thinking in an area. Therefore, we'd like to challenge you to consider the possibility in your own work across boundaries, that a boundary may certainly be viewed as a barrier, a limitation, or a constraint, absolutely. But it may also be viewed as an opportunity to engage in creative problem solving, innovative thinking, and positive change and transformation. We'd like to thank you for your attention during this webinar, and we do hope that you found it helpful. We would like to invite you to join our conversation that we started on boundary spanning leadership, and invite you to go to our website, www.spanboundaries.com. Here you'll find some more information about the book and the research behind it. You can share your own boundary spanning leadership stories, and also find some useful tools that can facilitate your own boundary spanning work, either that you're doing today or that you will probably most likely find yourself doing in the future if you're not already. So I'd like to turn it over now to Ellen, who can facilitate our question and answer session. Ellen?
Yeah, thank you, Donna and Chris. If you do have a question, I see we have one already submitted from Tomas, but please do type your question into the question box. And I will go ahead with this first question, Chris or Donna. What if the existing interests separate the groups to an extent which does not make it possible for them to step out from their identities? Who would like to take that one?
I can take a first shot. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I bet, Donna, we're thinking the same thing. So my quick response, and I'll throw it back to you, is start at the beginning around managing boundaries. And this is exactly the case that we saw in an organization we worked with in South Africa, in a post-apartheid financial company, in which they were completely transforming the demographic backgrounds of leaders all the way up to the executive team. And in their work there, they had to, those identities were not ready to be transformed. There was not readiness for that. And so the case we describe in the book around that was around how two leaders in particular, one a black South African and a white South African, were able to use the practice of buffering to be able to create an environment at least where groups felt safe. It all begins with safety. That's the very first practice. The outcome of buffering is creating a context for safety. And it's amazing how, whether in an organization like South Africa or even with senior teams that I work with, basic issues of threat, of ego, of security are present in all types of organizations. And so my response, and Donna, I'll give it back to you, is start by creating an environment where groups feel psychologically secure. And that then becomes the container, the larger space that then opens up the opportunity for, over time, the next practice of reflecting to occur. And reflecting, the outcome of reflecting, if you recall, is respect. Respect creates a platform for the third practice of connecting, which opens up for trust. So start where you are and recognize that you're right, that often these issues are about much deeper issues than what might be the presenting issue. They're about they're deep issues of identity. Donna, any other thoughts?
I think that's a great response. Threat is the key word, and there's a lot of evidence in the research literature to suggest this as well, that when groups feel threatened, they hold on to their identities, not release them or suspend them. They draw them closer and make them more prominent, if you will. And so that's the trick, is to really create an environment of safety and security so that then people can move to that idea of suspending those differences. So what we have to do is take threat out of the equation, out of the picture.
Just one other thought, and Ellen, I'll give it back to you, is Don and I, we believe, and CCL, based on this work, that this whole idea of boundarylessness is a myth. And we think that it's actually not the right approach to be only talking about how do we get rid of boundaries, how do we break them down, how do we dismantle boundaries all around us. Because they do serve a fundamental and necessary purpose, and they're not going away anytime soon. So the challenge is not just how do we make them go away, but how do we adapt, change, and modify them by using these types of practices we've been talking about in order to move your organizations, to be able to move your communities forward.
Okay, we have two questions that I think are related, so I'm going to read both of those to you, and you can choose where to start. The first one's from Daniel. Excuse me. You have identified things that could be done to change the system, but are there things that an organization or a leader can do to empower the people to develop these personal qualities, to not be stymied by the boundaries, so that things that divide becomes things that don't matter so much, or things that can help the individual involved to perhaps develop emotional intelligence, etc. And then the other question comes from Casey. To implement this in our sector, what critical issues will make or break our success? What's foundational, in other words?
Mm-hmm. Donna, maybe if you can ponder a little bit the second one there. I have an immediate thought around the first. Is the interesting thing, Daniel, around these practices is that the role of, again, we talk about leadership as a social process, creating directional alignment, commitment across outcomes. But those of us in leadership roles do have a central role, and it's really the role of facilitator, of catalyst, of mobilizer. And so a leader cannot make any of these practices happen. You cannot make connecting or reflecting or mobilizing happen. What you do is you create a space for them to happen. And so to your question, you empower people by giving the space for these practices to naturally occur. And so if you go to the website, you can find, for example, for each practice, there's a link called Your Tactics. We list 15 dozen or so different specific tactics, things that you could start doing on Monday as a leader to begin helping to empower others to do these. And they're often quite simple, but you really, as a leader, are playing the role of facilitator in creating an environment in which groups are able to work together in new types of ways.
Let me try to address the second part of that question. So it was around, what might make this effort, boundary spanning, successful? What will make or break that experience? And I think one of the things that we have found in our work is that it's very common for leaders to sort of skip the managing boundaries and jump to developing common ground or focusing on those similarities. So we often hear people say, well, we need to all be on the same page, we need to all row in the same direction. And that's good, but the problem with that is that if you skip to that without first laying the foundation of managing boundaries and creating that sense of safety and security, that again, you will introduce that notion of threat. So in our work, we found that this was a process, and it was important to follow that process. And if you are already have a work environment where the groups are well identified and they know what their roles are and they feel safe within those roles and identities, then you can certainly jump to forging common ground. But if you're not there yet, then you need to go back to the beginning and start there. And then, of course, the second piece of this is to, as we finished our presentation, to really develop a mindset to view boundaries not as barriers or limitations or borders or constraints, but rather new opportunities that are waiting there to be tapped into, and the energy that exists when you bring those the right people into the room from across those boundaries to really tap into that potential.
Well, just to honor our time, I need to say that we need to bring the questions to a close at this point. And so I would encourage anyone who has further desire to talk to the speakers to go ahead and please be in touch with them with your questions or your interests. And so thank you, Chris and Donna, for taking the time to be with us today. And I would like now to announce the winners of the book giveaway.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have that here. Let's see. We have 4 winners. These were people chosen at random from the participant list. The folks who have won the copy of the Boundary Spanning Leadership book are Travis G. from Whittier, California, Richard C. from Mechanicsville, Virginia, just down the road from us, Lisa P. from Orlando, Florida, and Olga D. all the way from Greece. So congratulations to those 4 winners, and Ashley will be shipping those books out to you directly very soon. And then I just want to say, if you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you will also be able to join us for the next installment of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series, which will be Leadership for the Future, How to Be a Better Leader and Build Effective Leadership, with Dave Ulrich, who is a professor at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. That will be held at noon Eastern Time on February 28th. So please visit www.ilanet.org for more details. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.